Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. So today I'm just going to be doing a quick little video and running through some really easy, well, I don't know if they're easy, straightforward, some tips on how to create subtext. This is something that I think I get a lot of questions about and something a lot of people are wondering, and such an important part of a compelling story is to have subtext, and subtext is what's not said, right? Everything that is in the unsaid. And it can be very hard to explain because it's like, what's the stuff you don't say? And so it's like the shadow of the story, it's what's lurking under the story, and so much complexity and depth lives in the subtext. It can be very hard to explain. But I think I've come up with 7 pretty easy to understand tips on how to create subtext, help, bring that subtext out of your story. And I'm just going to start by saying that I do think that subtext is similar to symbolism, where sometimes it's something you maybe don't want to focus on the first draft. I think subtext will emerge naturally in a lot of cases. And trying to force subtext is almost the way to kill the subtext. Like if you're trying to force subtext, it's probably going to be really awkward. I think it's one of those things that you kind of just have to let grow and let emerge, and then you'll see it, and then you can refine it on the second draft to make sure that, nothing is contradictory and you're trimming away things that maybe would be burying the subtext or contradicting the subtext. So I wouldn't stress too much about creating subtext on the first draft. Instead, I would view the first draft as the place for subtext to emerge naturally and be observant for it, be on the lookout for subtext. The thing about subtext is because it is unsaid, often it is unknown even to us as the writer while we are writing, and it's going to emerge subconsciously. Sometimes I think the first draft is not about planting subtext, but looking for the subtext as it emerges naturally. And then in further drafts, you can refine that, and it's pretty exciting when you're writing and you start to notice subtext emerge that you weren't even planning. So let's just jump into some tips. So the first tip, give the characters goals, yearnings, wants that are both concrete and emotional and internal. This is basic writing. So if you're not giving your characters goals and desires and wants, then you're probably missing a core element of plot and conflict because it's so important to most stories, but it's also so key for subtext. Characters who don't have goals are not going to withhold anything. They're not going to tailor their behavior or what they say in any way because they don't have anything they want. But as soon as you have characters who have goals, and especially if you have 2 characters who have goals and they're interacting with each other, now they're going to act in a way that tries to get them closer to what they want. And that's going to mean not saying certain things or saying things that are not completely true. Soon as characters have goals, especially internal goals, internal wants, internal or emotional desires, emotional needs that they are trying to fulfill, there will be subtext that will start to emerge because they will withhold and they will act in a way that tries to get them closer to a goal. It's how people are, and if your characters are fleshed out people, they will do that on the page. If you have well-developed characters with yearnings that are internal and emotional as well as external, and you have other characters who are implicated in those goals, there will be subtext if you let that subtext emerge. Tip number 2, give your character something to do and let that emerge through symbolism. I've talked about this tip before. It's one of my favorite writing tips because it is so easy, and it's just give your character something to do. If you have 2 characters who say want something from each other, so there's going to be subtext between them, and there's going to be tension and heat there, right? Those are the kinds of relationships we love. And you put them in a situation and you let them talk and they're just talking, okay, there might be subtext, but there will be a lot more subtext if they are doing something. Anytime you have characters just talking, I think it helps to give them something to do. Giving the character something to do physically while they are speaking allows for a lot of subtext to emerge through symbolism because whatever it is they are interacting with will become like a symbolic vehicle, right? If your 2 characters are building a treehouse together, the way they are building the treehouse and the parts of the treehouse, the way they talk about the treehouse will start to reflect their relationship. It's almost something you can't even plan for, but it will happen. If you have a symbolic vehicle and you have characters who want something from each other and they're interacting with this symbolic vehicle, it will happen. If the characters are developed, you can just let that emerge. And it will emerge in most cases. So give the characters something to do and something in the world to interact with, and that will breed a lot of subtext through symbolism. Tip 3, let powerful images stand on their own. Really powerful images can really be a great vehicle for subtext, especially if they're well placed, say at the end of a section. That image can reveal something through symbolism. Try to resist the urge to explain it. When you have those great images, just let it stand on its own. When you have a great image and you're like, oh, this is a revealing image, this image speaks to themes and ideas in the character. Try not to explain it, just let it stand on its own and trust the reader to pick up on that impact. Trust in the power of the image that you've created. it can be, and I catch myself doing this really easy, to start explaining the images and almost explaining what the subtext is. But if you have that really strong image and it's pulling its weight subtextually and symbolically, just let it breathe and it'll be a lot more powerful that way. Tip number 4, keep track of who knows what. A lot of subtext emerges between characters and how they're interacting with each other and what they're withholding from each other, and that can start to get muddled if you lose track of what your characters know versus don't know. The secrets that a character keeps and the information they hold close to them and reveal or don't reveal, a lot of subtext starts to gather in those hidden places. And it can be easy to keep track, especially in a first-person narrative, of your own character's secrets while losing track of the other character's secrets. Keep track of everyone's secrets and what everyone knows versus doesn't know, because that is going to impact, like I said at the beginning, what they say and how they speak to each other and what they hold versus don't withhold. And so if you want to keep a consistent character writing that is consistent with the subtext and the subtext that is emerging, it is really important to just really be aware of the information and what information everyone has, especially if there are a lot of secrets and stuff like that. Tip number 5, let characters talk about nothing or talk around the point. This goes along with what I said earlier about giving the characters something to do, because a lot of the time when you give them something to do, they will talk around the point because they'll talk about the thing they're doing rather than what's actually at hand, right? So if two characters are in conflict with each other, rather than just having them talk about the conflict, let them talk about something else completely, but what they're talking about, they're really talking about the conflict, right? Like I said about the treehouse, if you have two characters who've been fighting, but now they're building a treehouse together, let's say it's a couple and they have a young kid and they're building a treehouse for their kid, but they've been fighting. As they build the treehouse, they may not talk about the fight, but they will talk about the treehouse, and they will start to talk about the treehouse in a way that mirrors the fight and say things without really saying them by talking about the treehouse. Let your characters talk about nothing. Let them talk around the point. Let them talk about other stuff. That can be some of the most valuable dialogue in your work, when characters are talking about something completely outside the point, because that's when they're actually going to be the most revealing and they're actually going to reveal their true feelings through subtext. Tip number 6, reveal information with unspoken further implications. When you reveal information, think about how you can reveal information that will percolate in future scenes, even if it's not being acknowledged. I was thinking about this because it came up in a book that I was writing unintentionally, but I wrote this scene where the main character is talking with this other character. There's some tension between them, these characters who are really drawn to each other in ways they shouldn't be drawn to each other. And this other character tells her backstory and tells this, traumatic thing that had happened to her that the main character didn't know about. That information is now, even if it's never spoken of again, going to sit between every interaction these characters have. Every time they talk, especially because the backstory that was revealed does kind of mirror what the protagonist is trying to do. Here's a main character who's trying to take advantage of someone for their own gain, and this other person who just told a story about a time that they were taken advantage of for someone else's gain. It makes it a lot darker for the protagonist that they continue to pursue this relationship. It makes it a lot more tragic for this other character that we feel like, oh, this is going to happen to her again. But that's not going to be acknowledged. You can just reveal information, and then you don't have to acknowledge that it's having an effect on their relationship. The reader is going to remember this information and is going to remember that this information has really changed the dynamic, even if the characters don't speak of it, even if they don't acknowledge it. When you reveal information, think about how that information is going to impact future interactions in unspoken ways. And finally, tip number 7, allow for explicit reflection too. As great as subtext is, and it's really great to have that undercurrent in a story of things that are not spoken, not everything in your story needs to be subtextual, and it can be easy to fall into a trap of thinking everything needs to be subtext and nothing needs to be stated. And I talk about this more in my video on Show Don't Tell and why telling is really important. Explicit reflection is okay too. It is okay for characters to reflect in the text on their wants, on their flaws, on their desires, how they feel about things, on their feelings. That is okay, and you need and you even want some level of that. That brings us closer to a character, to be let into their mind in that way. And that even strengthens the subtext, because, having a character reflect on how they feel can breed even more subtext. But trying to push everything, every feeling, every emotion, every desire, every yearning to subtext will make the subtext impossible to access. The reader has no way to really pierce into the narrative and to get deeper into the mind of this character. We're not going to be able to get close enough to the character to access the subtext. So while subtext is great, don't be afraid of overtness either. It is actually great to unpack things on the page and unpack ideas on the page and unpack themes on the page. that's great. I can't tell you the line of what needs to be stated and what doesn't. That's really just up to you in your work. That's just a choice that an author needs to make of whether or not something should be stated or left to subtext. But not everything needs to or should be left to subtext. Having a level of clear on-the-page reflection and dissection is actually a great addition to a book's complexity and will make a book more nuanced and more complex. So while subtext is great, not everything has to be subtext. Things can also be stated, and clarity is so important. I used to feel like a character's goal always had to be subtext for some reason. And so then no one ever knew my character's goals because I was writing short stories where, you know, it's very internal, and so the external plot is like very minimal. And so the character's goal is so important in understanding why they're doing things, but I felt that that couldn't be stated. And so my stories were always really confusing. Because of that, I started just clearly stating my character's goals. And then that gave the stories a lot more impact because, yes, something was stated explicitly, but that allowed for subtext through their actual interactions and actual scenes because we had that grounding point. You do need grounding point. I wouldn't even say that the majority of a story's complexity should be subtext. If anything, subtext is kind of the seasoning, the je ne sais quoi, right? But it's not the base of a story. The most important key aspects of a story can and should be on the page, and then the subtext and everything that's lurking underneath can kind of be that extra level of depth that really draws us into a story. So that is all for today's video on how to create subtext. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.